Welcome everyone to this our second day in our Conversation Days series at IOCS this year. Christ is risen.
Is risen indeed.
Gives me a great pleasure to welcome Dr Christopher and Elizabeth again for today. Just make a few practical announcements, but also just to tell you a little bit about the Institute if you're here for the first time. Welcome if you're here, if it's your first time here. That was a good sound. That number over there on the board is not a cryptic number, it's not a quiz about, at the end there won't be a question about what that number is historically. It's just the code to the loo, which is outside at the entrance, as it were, in the college. You will find it very easily. I think there's another one through that door on the fire exit, so that's useful to know. We've decided to have these conversation days at the Institute to address important topics in our lives as Christians, in our lives as researchers, or just people of faith. And this Saturday we're addressing this topic of the encounter between science and religion, very much with an Orthodox perspective on these issues. And I hope that this will be a very interesting and enlightening day for you by the end of it. The Institute does more than just this outreach and community days, conversation days. We mainly offer postgraduate studies, MA, PhD research. We very much spearheaded distance learning, so we're trying to expand our educational offering and also the way that we make our courses accessible, not just in the UK but throughout the world. So do visit our website. It's very easy. If you just Google IOCS or Orthodox Studies Cambridge, that will come up. If you enjoy today's day and you feel that we are worthy of support, do very much get involved in spreading the word about the Institute and helping practically if you can. We are here to serve not just the Orthodox Church, but ecumenical encounter, dialogue, asking important and relevant questions, and trying to give some answers from a perspective that would otherwise be missing from the conversation. So, I think I've said all I wanted to say. I will hand over to Christopher, to Christoph, my colleague, the academic director of the Institute, to introduce Father Christopher. Thank you. Yes, dietary requirements. The kitchen is asking about dietary requirements. If any of you have any food allergies or are vegan, or just let me know, and we'll let them know they can still make these adjustments before lunch, which is at around 12 o'clock. So hands up.
If we know now, it would be better.
Yes, tell me now, and we can let them know. So, vegan. Excellent. Vegan too.
Diabetic.
Okay.
Little sugar, supposed to be very little carbohydrates as well, I'm told.
Yes. Well,
leaves little, doesn't leave much left.
well, I think you can negotiate that, John. So. Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker. It is Revd Dr Christopher Knight, or Father Christopher. He's a senior research associate of our institute and also a member of the board of directors. He works as a parish priest of the Church of the Holy Transfiguration in Great Walsingham, Norfolk, and also as the executive secretary of the International Society for Science and Religion. So his main research interest is in the relationship between theology and the sciences. That's why we have invited him today. And he has published numerous articles and, as far as I know, 2 books with the title Wrestling with Divine Religion, Science and Revelation. That was 2001, and the second one is called The God of Nature, Incarnation and Contemporary Science. And he's working on another book with the title Science and the Orthodox Christian, A Guide for the Perplexed. And I think you haven't completed the manuscript yet.
In practice, I've put that slightly on one side in order to write another book, which in fact the St. Vladimir Seminary Press will be bringing out, I hope, by the end of this year, which is called Christianity and Science. I've forgotten what the subtitle is. It's something like An Eastern Orthodox View of the Science-Theology Dialogue. So, as I say, the book that you mentioned will be a follow-on from that to some extent.
Okay. Thank you very much. And today, Father Christoph is going to talk about modern science and Orthodox Christianity, friends or foes. Or here, a slightly different version, science and Orthodox.
I did it from memory, I'm afraid, when I made the slide.
Okay, Father Christoph, thank you very much for coming, and over to you.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. I'm suffering, as you may gather from my voice, from actually quite a nasty cold, so I'm not able to project my voice quite as well as I could at one time. I remember when I was a schoolboy and in my school's cadet force, a naval chief petty officer watching me drill a squad once said to one of my schoolmasters, "I don't know if he frightens them, but by God he frightens me." I can't do that today because I don't have the ability to project my voice in the way that perhaps I would like. My background is a curious one in some ways, in that my PhD is actually in astrophysics, not in theology. I only turned to theology at a later stage in the days when I was preparing for ordination in the Church of England. I made the transfer to the Orthodox Church in 2002 and was ordained as a priest within that church in 2009. So I have a background which is both scientific and, from the Christian point of view, ecumenical. One or two preliminary comments I'd like to make before I begin. First of all, I'm delighted that Elizabeth Theokritoff has agreed to be the respondent to me after this talk, and also to give the talk this afternoon. Many of you will know her book, Living in God's Creation, Orthodox Perspectives on Ecology, which is much better known than my last book, The God of Nature, Incarnation and Contemporary Science. Quite rightly, I think, in many ways. Obviously, Elizabeth has a very particular interest in ecological issues. I also am interested in ecological issues and indeed in various ethical issues related to the sciences, but it's not on those that I shall be concentrating this morning, but rather on the more fundamental questions that arise in relation to the sciences, because there does seem to have grown up, particularly in the last few years in the Orthodox Church, an anti-science attitude, which personally I rather regret, as will become clear from what I say. Again, one or two preliminary things. First of all, why are there laws of nature which the scientists can get at? The picture, a rather blurred one, some of you will recognise from Monty Python's Flying Circus, where certainly in the early episodes this 16-ton weight would suddenly drop from above and bring the sketch to an end. The very fact that we don't live in that sort of world tells us something about the relationship between God and the world. God is consistent. God does not act capriciously. And if we ask why it is that at least at one level we're able to understand the world and predict it, it's at least partly because human free will requires that we can predict the outcome of our actions. If I were to take not a 16-ton weight, which I couldn't weight, but let's say a 16-pound weight, and hold it over Elizabeth's foot and then let it go, I can predict that it will fall to the ground and it might do a great deal of damage to her foot. I have an ethical reluctance to do that, and it's part of the free will which God has given us in this world. So it's not surprising that we live in a world where that sort of prediction, the sort of most elementary sort of scientific prediction, is something that's built into the way the world actually is. Now, obviously, science itself is not just about ethics in that sense. It's not just about technology, though that must have arisen very early in human history. It's also a matter of curiosity. Even if we go back to the megalithic monuments of northwest Europe, we can often see that there had been astronomical observation often of a quite detailed kind, and this goes back many thousands of years. And certainly by the time we come to the time of the ancient Greeks, several centuries before the Christian era, it's quite clear that science, not as we now know it perhaps, but science certainly was already very sophisticated. That ancient Greek science was passed on largely through Eastern Christian communities to Islam. In Islam, with borrowings from Indian mathematics, it was refined and passed on, eventually into the Western Middle Ages. And then, in the early 17th century, something rather extraordinary happened historically, that there was a sudden flourishing of science in its modern form. And we think particularly of figures like Newton in relation to that. Many people have seen that flourishing of science as coming out of a specific theological view. And indeed, some have argued that it could only have happened in a Protestant rather than, let's say, a Catholic environment. That's simply something that historians still argue about. But nevertheless, the idea that science is somehow anti-Christian, which one gets in a number of Orthodox authors, simply isn't true to the history of science. Most of those early scientists in the 17th century, the early 18th century, were devout Christians who saw their activity as trying to discover something about the ways of God in the world. So that's the first preliminary thing that I would like to say. The second, I think, is this, that whether we're anti-science or pro-science, we can actually rather easily project our prejudices, if you like, onto the reality of science. And projecting prejudices is something we have to be really rather careful about, because it does mean sometimes that we can completely misread what it is that we're examining. The best example I've ever come across this is a book review that appeared in the magazine Field and Stream, which, with a title like that, is, as you imagine, a magazine that was aimed at the hunting and shooting and fishing fraternity. And for some reason, this may be an apocryphal story, but it's widely told, it decided at some point to write a book review of D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover. And the book review ended as follows. This fictional account of the day-to-day life of an English gamekeeper is still of considerable interest to outdoor-minded readers, as it contains many passages on pheasant rearing, the apprehending of poachers, ways to control vermin, and other chores and duties of the professional gamekeeper. Unfortunately, one is obliged to wade through many pages of extraneous material in order to discover and savour these sidelights on the management of a Midland shooting estate, and in this reviewer's opinion, the book cannot take the place of J.R. Miller's Practical Gamekeeper. Well, just an example. If we expect to find something, we tend to see it there, even when in practice what we're looking at is rather richer perhaps than we imagine it to be. Okay, so if we move on to the way in which historically science and theology have been seen as interacting, Ian Barber, in a classic book published in 1966, Issues in Science and Religion, talked about 4 ways in which they had been related historically. First, he said there was conflict. There were times when science and theology were seen as being in conflict. Second, he said, there's the attitude of independence, the attitude that science and theology are doing such very different things, the one asking how questions and the other asking why questions, that they simply never interact. So obviously conflict does represent the attitude of science and religion being foes. Independence doesn't see them as foes, but doesn't really see them as friends either, because it tends to see them as neighbours who nod politely to one another when they pass, but otherwise don't have much interaction. But the 2 other ways in which Barber saw science and theology interacting, which he called dialogue and integration, do come out of the idea that science and theology do have at least something to say to one another, and in particular that theology needs to take into account the way the sciences are telling us something about the world. Now, we can see these attitudes, certainly the first 2, both in the work of scientists and in the understanding of theologians. Western Christian views of conflict often arise, for example, from biblical literalism. The picture there shows a creationist museum somewhere in the US, in which Adam is shown playing with little dinosaurs and mammoths and various things of that sort. So young earth creationism, the idea that the world was only produced about 6,000 years ago and that the book of Genesis accounts of the creation are to be read literally, represents one version of this. There's also the more general Genesis versus evolution type of debate which is going on among certain Protestants. And we should note that Orthodox versions of both of these have actually appeared in recent years. I shall come back to that. The other Western view of conflict comes out of what's sometimes called intelligent design, or ID. This is the idea that you can't sort of attack the neo-Darwinian understanding of evolution purely from the point of view of Genesis, so you try and do it scientifically, and you provide a sort of quasi-scientific justification for rejecting that particular scheme. I know of no serious biologists who would take that view unless they already have a predisposition to some sort of fundamentalism. But nevertheless, it's around and it does have its effect in some parts of the Orthodox world. There are Orthodox conflict theorists, and the two who I think are most widely read, certainly in the English-speaking world, are Philip Sherard and Father Seraphim Rose. Philip Sherard, I should say in advance, is to me one of the most stimulating Orthodox writers of the 20th century in all sorts of ways. But his writing is spoiled for me by something that comes out of his attitude towards science. He fails to make a proper distinction, first of all, between science and what's sometimes called scientism. I will talk a little bit about scientism in a minute. And also he tends to reject the distinction between pure science and its technological application. And although I share with him many of his worries about the way in which technology is transforming our world, it doesn't seem to me to have anything to say to the sort of pure science which I did my PhD in all those years ago and have largely forgotten. Father Seraphim Rose, I think, is a slightly different category, although widely read. He's the only person I know who hasn't been declared a saint who you can very easily buy an icon of, which says something about the prestige he has in certain parts of the Orthodox world. But he exhibits a kind of fundamentalism, not in relation so much to the Genesis accounts, as to certain patristic understandings. And I simply say that if you want a thoughtful critique from within the Orthodox community, Elizabeth Theokritoff, who's speaking this afternoon, and her husband George, wrote an interesting article published in the St. Vladimir's Theological Quarterly 16 years ago, and that's available online, and it seems to be a thoughtful and not, as I say, not particularly polemical, but a thoughtful critique of the sort of attitude you find in somebody like Father Seraphim. Now, of course, there are atheist views of conflict as well. Often they relate to oversimplifications or even errors about the history of science and religion. In the late 19th century in particular, there were two American authors who, in a sense, created the myth that science and theology are always in conflict. And the book that's shown on the slide, Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion, edited by Ron Numbers, is a very useful antidote, if you like, to that particular view. The relationship between science and religion has in practice been a complex one, sometimes involving tensions, often in practice involving the support of the Church for science. Even Galileo himself had supporters within the Catholic Church. So one has to be very careful about accepting that myth. But perhaps even more powerful in the modern world is what we might call scientism and what's sometimes called the new atheism. Scientism is a philosophical position. It basically says the sciences and their methodology provide the only reliable knowledge that we have about the world. And if we look in the community of philosophers, we find that in fact something like that sort of scientism in the form of logical positivism was in fact quite popular around the middle of the 20th century. It was represented, for example, in books like A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth and Logic, which was read by many people outside the professional theological community. But it's interesting that there are almost no professional philosophers who would actually take that view now. So one has to be very careful about assuming that science only is the only way of getting any sort of reliable knowledge. And the new atheism is even worse. It's well known through books like The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. And Dawkins, a biologist, a very good popularizer of science, and many others have, in a sense, attacked religion, setting up a sort of straw man of what they think religion is, and then showing that it can't stand up to rational inquiry. Now, one of the things I think one has to remember here is that the new atheism isn't very philosophically nuanced, and other atheists are able to think philosophically in a much more sophisticated way. And what I call atheist wars has broken out to some extent between Dawkins himself and Michael Ruse, a very interesting philosopher of biology, who actually, if you want to know why atheism is not an unreasonable option, he's written on that in a very interesting way. But Ruse has said this about Dawkins' The God Delusion. I have written that the God delusion made me ashamed to be an atheist, and I meant it. Trying to understand how God could need no cause, Christians claim that God exists necessarily. I have taken the effort to try to understand what that means. Dawkins and company are ignorant of such claims and positively contemptuous of those who even try to understand them, let alone believe them. Thus, like a first-year undergraduate, he can happily go round asking loudly, what caused God, as though he'd made some momentous philosophical discovery. So again, as Christians, we don't have to be on the back foot in relation to the new atheism. It's very often philosophically incoherent and illiterate, and there are atheist philosophers who will back up that judgment. Let's move on to independence. Again, we find scientific and theological views of the independence of science and theology. The biologist Stephen Jay Gould, for example, has coined this rather peculiar phrase, non-overlapping magisteria. But what he really means is they just don't interact. And he's using it, and many people in America particularly are using it, to try to keep theology out of science teaching. They say what we teach in the classroom in science lessons must be based firmly on the scientific methodology. If you want to discuss these things in religious studies lessons, that's fine, but don't bring it into science. But also from the theological point of view, we can see a number of Western theological frameworks which take this sort of view. The early work of Karl Barth, for example, often called neo-orthodoxy, had very much that view. Various existentialist theologies that were popular around the middle of the 20th century also took that view. And more recently, George Lindbeck's theology, rooted in a Wittgenstein's understanding of language, his linguistic analysis, also takes an independence point of view. And again, within the Orthodox Church, we can find people who take essentially this sort of view. In fact, it's probably the most common. And one, if somebody like, for instance, Metropolitan Callistos of Dioclea talks about science, which he does occasionally in his talks, he will take a sort of independence view, partly because it doesn't attack science, but at the same time it says, look, we don't have to worry about it too much in terms of theology. Probably the most sophisticated view of this sort is in the work of Alexei Nesteruk, who is a cosmologist, but who's written a number of rather weighty tomes, shall we say, basically trying to persuade people that the Orthodox understanding of science is completely different from the Western one. And he takes what he calls a phenomenological approach. And he sees both science and theology as legitimate manifestations of the human spirit. And he talks about a neo-patristic synthesis, something I shall mention later, but it's a sort of neo-patristic synthesis that bypasses questions about the consonance or dissonance of science and theology. So again, very common within the Orthodox world is this picture, science does one thing, theology does another, they don't really interact, they can nod politely to each other, but don't have to worry too much about each other. Let's think about dialogue and integration. Both of these categories are in practice now often spoken of as dialogue because Barber's original scheme actually didn't make a clear distinction between them. But what he called integration originally was things like scholasticism's natural theology, which talked about preambles to the faith, the idea that you can prove the existence of God philosophically before you even think about God's revelation of himself. Also things like systematic synthesis, as in the Protestant process theology that's based on the work of A.N. Whitehead in philosophy. And dialogue, he tends to talk about slightly less obviously integrationist schemes, boundary questions in people like Karl Rahner and David Tracy, and various methodological parallels, the idea that religious and scientific language are actually quite similar in certain respects, that religious and scientific rationality are also quite similar. And again, we can find voices in the Orthodox world which take an approach of this sort. These include, at the top there, Professor Basarab Niculescu, a quantum physicist who is a Romanian based partly in Paris, partly back in his homeland. Professor Gail Woloschak in America, who's done a lot of very good work thinking about evolution in an Orthodox context. Archbishop Lazar Puhalo down in the bottom left there, who, although he hasn't written anything very systematic about science and theology as such, has written a number of very short introductions to important theological topics, but bringing scientific insights, obviously, in little books like his one in which he talks about the neurobiology of sin, for example. The person down the right-hand side, I'm afraid you're going to hear more about as we go along, so I won't go much into him at the moment. But I would simply say that that tendency is also to be found historically in Orthodoxy, particularly in an integrationist way. Russian religious philosophy, Father Pavel Florensky, for example, can be seen as following this sort of path. So what I'm going to do in the rest of this talk is talk about issues from two different points of view. One is science and a sort of generic theism. And this has been actually the main focus of the Western science theology dialogue of the last 50 years. And it's one of my critiques of that particular approach, that it, for example, much that's been said in that dialogue would apply equally to science and Islam as it would to science and any particular form of Christianity. That is a critique, but it also, in a sense, allows people to stand back and see some of the issues perhaps more clearly than they would if they were approaching it very much from a particular theological perspective. So it has advantages as well as disadvantages. I shall then, in the second part of my talk, go on to talk about science and orthodox perspectives and ask the question, does the Orthodox tradition have anything special to bring to the discussion? And I shall suggest to you that it does indeed. So first of all, Western perspectives. I couldn't resist this because I think it looks rather like Bishop Rowan Williams, though in fact it's a late medieval fresco in Bergamo in Italy. But in a sense, it just gives us a sense that there are these Western perspectives. And I'm not going to talk about what the whole Western tradition over many hundreds of years has done, but to focus very particularly on what's often called the modern science theology dialogue, which followed in the wake of Barber's book in 1966. So what's been characteristic of that dialogue has been, first of all, a search for what's often called consonance between scientific and theological notions. And behind that, there's often been, at least partly, an apologetic notion. Now, this I don't think is a bad thing. If one thinks like early apologists in the patristic era, people like Clement and Justin Martyr, they were doing exactly the same thing in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. They were effectively saying to the educated people of their time, look, you don't have to throw away everything you think you know from the Greek philosophical tradition, for example, in order to be a Christian. Many of these people in this search for consonance are doing the same. They're addressing what Matthew Arnold, I think, called the cultured despisers of religion. They're saying you don't have to throw away everything that you think you know from our modern scientific and philosophical frameworks in order to hold Christian belief. The second thing is that although, as I've said, they to some extent are just theists, they do argue for what they call a theology of nature. And it starts from religious tradition rooted in revelation and religious experience, but it holds that some religious doctrines may need reformulation in the light of naturalistic understandings. An obvious example there is simply the question, how do we talk about the doctrine of creation in a world in which we have good reasons to believe in an evolutionary perspective on the world, and in particular biological evolution in its neo-Darwinian form? There's also been a reaction against a historical notion which was very important in Western theology from the 18th century onwards at least, what's been called the God of the gaps. And I shall explain that a little bit because I think it's something which many Orthodox quite instinctively bring to their understanding without realising it has very specific roots, not in their own tradition, but in a very specific aspect of the Western tradition. Much of this God of the Gaps attitude has its background in that 18th century tradition which was known as deism. The hardline deists, and not many people were hardline deists, but first of all they said, look, we live in a clockwork universe. This was the universe that Newton's physics seemed to imply. If we live in a clockwork universe, they said, what role does God have in it? Well, certainly he can design it and create it, rather like a clockmaker designs and makes a clock. But then what does the clockmaker got to do? Well, effectively, once it's wound up, nothing, except occasionally coming in, repairing bits perhaps, cleaning it up, whatever. So you had an absentee landlord creator God. And they still believed in that because they thought that there were certain design arguments, which I'll mention in a moment, which pointed in that direction. They couldn't actually imagine the world without a creator, but they could imagine a world in which God wasn't actually active on a day-to-day basis. There was also a philosophical problem about miracles, particularly discussed by David Hume. The hardline deists themselves simply didn't believe in miracles, simply because what's a miracle? It's setting aside the clockwork motion, but why do that? If you've designed a good clock, just let it run. So that was the sort of background that was there in the 18th century. And many people at that time, even if they weren't hardline deists, took up an attitude which I've referred to as semi-deism. They tend to look for proofs of God in gaps in explanation of causality. If they believed in miracles, they said, we can't explain miracles scientifically, therefore that points to God. If they didn't believe in miracles, like the deists themselves, they saw the design of the world, as they saw it, as pointing to the reality of God. Now, the problem with that sort of argument is that it completely collapsed in the mid-19th century. In the early 19th century, Paley famously had used the watchmaker analogy. He said, if you were just walking along one day and you looked down and you found a watch just sitting there, and he said, you picked it up, even if you didn't know what it was, you might open up the back, look at its intricate mechanism, and it would be quite clear to you that this was the product of an intelligent watchmaker. So that sort of argument pointed to the reality of God as far as he was concerned. The problem with the Darwinian picture, for those who put a lot of emphasis on that sort of argument, that these gaps tended to be filled. The way the world had this wonderful, intricate structure seemed in many ways to be understandable in pure evolutionary terms, in terms of mutation, in terms of the survival of the fittest, and so on. And it's interesting that I mentioned the ID movement, the intelligent design movement earlier. That movement represents an approach that still searches for a gap in exploration that will point towards the validity of an argument from design of the kind that Paley offered. Now, the interesting thing about Darwin is that many people, again, it's part of the science-religion conflict myth, think that Christians never really got round to accepting Darwin. Actually, in the 19th century, there were many people who not only saw Darwin's view as acceptable scientifically, but they even saw it as helping theology. And in particular, Aubrey Moore, in a book called Science and Faith, published in 1889, so not that long after Darwin, actually provided an early theological defence of Darwinism. Not in that book, but in another book, not an essay, in fact, he wrote a couple of years after it, he said, science, in the guise of a foe, acted on theology as a friend. And what he meant by that is summed up in that particular quotation at the bottom. The Darwinian view, he argued, is infinitely more Christian than the theory of special creation, the idea that God sort of said, let there be this, let there be that, let there be the other. For, he said, it implies the immanence of God in nature and the omnipresence of his creative power. Those who oppose the doctrine of evolution in defence of a continued intervention of God seem to have failed to notice that a theory of occasional intervention implies as its correlative a theory of ordinary absence. Now, from an Orthodox point of view, I think this is important because the Orthodox understanding of creation has never been a God who from outside the universe occasionally does odd things here and there, but a God who is working in and through the processes of the universe. And we'll talk about the theological background to that in a moment. But it's important to recognise that even in the 19th century, there were people like More who were arguing that, in fact, science in its Darwinian form, though it obviously poses questions about some ways of reading the book of Genesis, actually acts as a friend. Instead of having a transcendent God who only occasionally intervenes in the world, we have also a view of an immanent God who is working in and through every process. Now, since 1966, Ian Barber's book, Barber there in the middle, the science-theology dialogue in its early decades after that were dominated by three scientist theologians, Arthur Peacock, Barber himself, and John Polkinghorne. And in a sense, they took up what had been talked about by More quite a while earlier. There was a strong stress on naturalistic perspectives in talking about what was often called general divine action. But they all still wanted to defend God's responses to events in the world in what they called special divine action. And they believed that you could talk about some sort of causal joint that allows this special divine action to take place without God having to stop the laws of nature, do something, and then sort of start them up again. And this, for them, was backed up by the fact that modern physics had moved away from the old Newtonian picture of the universe, the clockwork model, the deterministic model, and actually pointed to the way in which modern physics seemed to be non-deterministic. It could only talk about probabilities, and that seemed to make possible this sort of picture of a causal joint. And so they started to speculate about the causal joint in various ways. William Pollard, even before that period, had already talked about quantum level indeterminacy as one of the ways in which God could interfere, so to speak, with the world without actually setting aside the laws of nature. Polkinghorne, who was himself a quantum physicist, actually didn't like that and talked about an unknown site of what he called ontological openness, which it was a bit of a hand-waving way of talking about the way quantum and chaotic phenomena pointed towards something which he couldn't quite get his fingers on, which allowed God to act in the world. And Peacock, being a biologist and interested in things like chemistry, talked about top-down effects, the way that parts are affected by the wholes of which they are constituents. But a word of warning, this sort of approach is attractive to many Orthodox, but there's been one major critique and one minor one, the minor one being my own, of this whole model. Nicholas Saunders, in a book published in 2002, looked at this whole thing in great detail and said, would it be correct to argue that the prospects for supporting anything like the traditional understanding of God's activity in the world are extremely bleak? To a large extent, the answer to this question must be yes. In fact, he said, it is no real exaggeration to state that contemporary theology is in a crisis. Well, I think that's true for Western theology, and I think it may not be true for Orthodox theology, because Orthodox theology brings a completely different conceptual scheme to these questions about how God acts in the world. And so I shall go on to say a little bit now about the Orthodox view. But first, just one or two other things that have been around in the Western dialogue. What about the soul or the mind, which often in Western thought are conflated with one another, though actually in ancient Orthodox thought there's a rather complex psychology which doesn't simply make that equation. First of all, there's been a philosophical understanding which refutes the claim that we are nothing but atoms and molecules. One of the great problems with science is that most of its methodology tries to look at the component parts of things and ask whether our understanding of the component parts enables us to understand the whole. So, for example, if we want to understand gases, can we actually understand gases simply in terms of the molecules of which they're made up? And the answer in gases, of course, is yes. But there's been a long discussion about whether we can really reduce everything in that way. And there is this distinction sometimes made between what's called methodological reductionism, which looks at the methodology of the science, and what's called ontological reductionism, the sort of sense that you get in some writers that in fact we really are nothing but atoms and molecules. We can forget everything that we've ever associated with the soul. That philosophically, again, doesn't work. The jury's still out, it's still an ongoing conversation. But it's important to recognise that science isn't simply reductionistic, in the way that some scientists think it is. And again, that's part of it's a kind of scientism. It's not science itself. And in particular, one or two writers have talked about emergence, the way in which complex systems can actually allow the emergence of really new, novel processes. So that the mind, for example, in that view, emerges from brain processes. But they say we've got to recognise feedback loops. It may be true that the human mind emerges from the brain, but the human mind also affects the brain. It's not one or the other. It's a constant loop that's going on. And with that sort of thing in mind, one writer has talked about whether it would be better to talk about the soul not as the soul, but in terms of what he calls embodied soulishness. And what he means by that is that we often think about the soul simply as another sort of substance. The mind or the soul is one substance, the body is another substance, and we tend to take a sort of ancient Greek philosophical view in which they're actually in some sort of temporary alliance. But it's interesting that, that represents actually not a Christian anthropology, it's actually ancient Greek dualism. And in this sense, theology can actually be informed by this sort of thinking, though I'd want to criticise aspects of it. Because although modern neuroscience points away from body-soul dualism, it does so in a way that actually points, for Orthodox at least, towards a more authentically Orthodox picture of humans as a unity of body and mind and spirit. And it's brought people actually in the Western dialogue to think about things like the resurrection of the body, compared to what very often was thought about 100 years ago, and sometimes is in the Orthodox world today, the idea of the escape of the soul from the body. The Orthodox view is not about a soul which is the real spiritual bit and the body which isn't. The Orthodox view is about the resurrection of the body. And to some extent, these insights from modern neuroscience help us to think through some of those issues. Also in the Western dialogue, before we get on to orthodoxy, there's been the question of miracles. And again, there's been a variety of opinions. Some actually have been rather wary of God's special action other than on the human mind, but others have actually pointed to things in the sciences that may help us think through miracles. Miracles, for example, have been thought of sometimes as analogous to what in the sciences are called regime change phenomena. Superconductivity is an obvious example. In certain materials, if you simply take their temperature down and down and down, suddenly there's a transition. Electrical resistance simply disappears. There's an enormous transition from one set of ways of behaving to another, and yet that's not non-naturalistic. So again, there's been this question, we have to be a little bit careful of talking about miracles always simply in this sort of supernaturalist, naturalist way. There may be other ways in which we can think about miracles. And also people have pointed out that the idea of the miracle implies wonder. It doesn't necessarily imply supernaturalism. And here, as I shall mention in a minute, there is a little bit of thinking about whether miracles as we understand them could be manifestations of what, in the work of St. Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century, could be seen as thinking about what he calls, well, he doesn't call them, but they've been interpreted in this way, as higher laws of nature. We'll come back to that. So, the dominant perspective in the Western dialogue, very briefly, science and theology are friends, not foes. Scientific understanding can be embraced as long as we realise that scientism itself is incoherent. We can, according to that view, defend God's special action in the world through a causal joint model, but we must remember Saunders' critique. We do not need to adopt a reductionistic nothing buttery, as it's sometimes called. We are nothing but atoms and molecules. We are more than atoms and molecules, and we can defend that philosophically. And we can affirm much that's traditionally associated with soul language through emergence theory. So that's where the science-theology dialogue in the West now more or less stands in a very brief, slightly caricaturish way. So, what a shame. I had a picture of a very long beard there and it seems to have disappeared, which is a great, yes, it says quick time, well, whatever. There was a gentleman with a very long beard. What does orthodoxy bring to this debate? The beard actually was not entirely a joke, because I think there is sometimes a tendency among orthodox to think that a person's theological insight and spirituality is in direct proportion to the length of the beard, and I think we have to be a little wary of that particular view. So tradition. This is the first thing that most people will say that orthodoxy brings to this. But we have to ask what this means. When we talk about the patristic witness, the witness of the fathers of the church, what do we really mean? When we read the fathers, we do certainly see a sort of harmony, but we also hear different notes. For example, the Antiochian and Alexandrian approaches to scripture in the early centuries were really rather different, in the sense that the Antiochians tended to read it rather literally, the Alexandrians tended to read it allegorically. There's also a question that Metropolitan Callistos has mentioned. Can we separate patristic wheat from patristic chaff? And what he means by that is the way the fathers express themselves sometimes involves arguments or bits of evidence that we would now not regard as being particularly useful to us. St. John Chrysostom, for example, seemed to believe in a flat earth, and indeed certainly speculated about the Antipodes, saying, well, they may exist if the world's round, but of course nobody could ever live there. I don't know if anybody here has ever lived in Australia, but clearly not something that we regard now as a good argument. We also have to ask what questions the fathers were asking. Father John Bear has made some interesting comments about this. He says, we Orthodox often look at the formulae that come out of the patristic witness, but we never ask, what were they actually trying to deal with? What was the question? And so he said, in a sense, we can misunderstand the answers the fathers gave because we simply don't understand the questions. And we also have the question, what do we do when the questions with which we are faced, by modern science, for example, are different to the ones the fathers asked? And also there's a question of methodology. Father George Florovsky very interestingly talked about the mind of the fathers and what he called a neo-patristic synthesis. There is this sense in strands of orthodoxy, certainly, that we can't simply quote the fathers as though their words were somehow inspired in a straightforward way. We've got to ask, what was their mind? How did that mind get expressed in the particular words and arguments that they use? And that mind ultimately comes back to a spiritual state. It's not just a matter of logical argument. And when we talk about science in particular, we have to recognise the fathers actually often used the science of their time, but it was sometimes mistaken, as I've said. We need to understand, first of all, the religious meaning of their use of the sciences of their time. It's no good saying St. John Chrysostom seemed to believe in a flat earth, therefore we must be too. Secondly, as I've already mentioned, there are literalist and allegorical approaches to Scripture. And we have to recognise in relation to that, for example, there were non-literalist understandings of Genesis. If we read St. Gregory of Nyssa on Genesis, for example, we actually have something rather different to the reading we get in some of the other fathers, even of the same period. I think this has been summed up very well by Metropolitan Callistos, who says this about tradition. Loyalty to tradition, properly understood, is not something mechanical, a passive and automatic process of transmitting the accepted wisdom of an era in the past. An orthodox thinker must see tradition from within. He must enter into its inner spirit. He must re-experience the meaning of tradition in a manner that is exploratory, courageous, and full of imaginative creativity. The orthodox conception of tradition is not static but dynamic, not a dead acceptance of the past, but a living discovery of the Holy Spirit in the present. Tradition, while inwardly changeless, for God does not change, is constantly assuming new forms which supplement the old without superseding them. So if that, to me at least, is the right way of approaching tradition in relation to science, we also have to recognise other aspects of the orthodox approach. One of these is the question of what do we mean by matter, the matter of the world? There's a strongly sacramental view in some strands of orthodox thinking. Philip Sherard, I think, is at his best when he says that what is indicated or revealed in the sacrament is something universal, the intrinsic sanctity or spirituality of all things, what one might call their real nature. He uses the word sacrament. We Orthodox, of course, tend to use the word mystery instead, but the meaning is very important there. And secondly, in Father Alexander Schmemann in particular, he says the sacrament is a revelation of the genuine nature of creation. So we have a very strong view of the world in which we live. It's not simply a conglomeration of matter in which we live. It's matter which is transparent, at least potentially, in all its aspects, to the glory and the presence of God. Another issue about matter is one that I've only become aware of recently, and I shall rather run through it because we don't have a vast amount of time. But I've asked myself the question, is the Orthodox view an idealist one which in fact puts mind before matter? Very often people think of idealism in terms of the famous 18th century Anglican Bishop George Berkeley. Some of you will know the rather poor limerick which talks about Bishop Berkeley, who remarked metaphysically darkly, quite half what we see couldn't possibly be, and the rest's altogether unlikely. Terrible rhyme at the end. There's also another one about the tree and the quad, which I can't remember offhand. But the important thing is that for Berkeley, he had a very strong sense that, in a sense, everything we think of as matter is the product of the divine mind. And in a sense, mind has priority over matter. And it's very interesting that, again, only relatively recently, people have said that St. Gregory of Nyssa actually had views very comparable to Berkeley's, and that a convergence between Gregory's views and that of the quantum physicist David Bohm seems possible. So there's a new area of understanding here, which is only just being opened up, in fact, both in Orthodoxy and in Western theology as well. And one of the things that seems important to me here is that there were two British astrophysicists in the early part of the 20th century who both had, in a sense, an idealistic instinct of this sort. They both wrote popular books which basically said the world looks more like a great thought than an accumulation of matter. And actually, because they weren't trained philosophers, it was very easy for Susan Stebbing, who was, to actually tear them apart at a philosophical level. But we've still got the question, is their instinct about the implication of modern physics still a valid one? As I say, I'll jump through that. If anybody wants to talk about it later, I'm happy to do so. But the Orthodox picture of matter, and increasingly interesting a wider theological picture of matter, is beginning to ask these questions. Okay, if we ask about the Orthodox tradition of God and the cosmos, what do we want to particularly note? First of all, as I mentioned earlier, this word supernatural does get used sometimes in Orthodox theology. You see it particularly in some modern Orthodox theology, Father Staniloy in Romania, for example. But the usual way of talking about the created order is not to talk about the difference between the natural and the supernatural, as Western theology has tended to, but to make the distinction between the creator and the created. This is actually, I think, something quite important, which we'll come back to. The second thing is that in the West, there's been a tendency to separate grace and nature. This goes all the way back to St. Augustine. But again, Vladimir Lossky, although it seems to have done funny things here, says the Eastern tradition knows nothing of pure nature, to which grace is added as a supernatural gift. For it, there is no natural or normal state, since grace is implied in the act of creation itself. Again, it's this Orthodox sense that, we're not just a jumble of matter, which grace has to somehow enter from outside. Grace is implied in the act of creation itself. There's also the sense that God is in everything, and everything is in God, what's sometimes given the rather peculiar title panentheism. And we can see this both in St. Maximus the Confessor, when he talks about the logoi of created things, and St. Gregory Palamas, when he talks about the divine energies. And again, this is something which is very distinctive of the Orthodox understanding of the created world. Partly it goes back to Pseudo-Dionysius, and I've quoted here from Elizabeth's chapter in the book she edited with Mary Cunningham, the Cambridge Companion to Orthodox Christian Theology. I think I'll have to jump through it rather than read it out, simply because of constraints of time. But it's important that, again, there is this sort of sense that all created things work together to the glory of God. If we might come back to that slide afterwards if anybody wants to. In Maximus, we have this sense of the divine logos. In the beginning was the word, the logos, and the recognition that this logos is in the fourth gospel word, reason, principle involved in the creation itself. It's something which arises at least in part from the New Testament, the Old Testament understanding of wisdom. And for St. Maximus the Confessor, the divine logos is manifested in the logoi of created things, the words of created things from the beginning, and the logoi of prophetic utterance in the era before the logos is manifested in the person of Jesus Christ. And of course, Maximus has become a very major figure in Orthodox thinking, particularly over the last 50 years or so. If we, again, this is a quotation from Metropolitan Callistos, which I will jump through, though again we can come back to that if anybody wants to. And we can, again, with St. Gregory Palamas, again a quotation about the divine energies, which both of those quotations from Metropolitan Callistos talking about what is often called panentheism. What I want to just point out is that, particularly in the idea of the logoi of creation, there is a teleological sense. Now, what I mean by that is that the word telos means the final goal. And in Western medieval philosophy, there was an idea that, for example, if I picked something up and dropped it, why did it drop? Not because of gravity, it's because that was its natural final end. So there's a sort of teleology in Aristotelian science, which was simply of that sort. In Maximus, we have actually something which is far more complex than that. And first of all, the logos of each created thing is that which makes it, again, quote, distinctively itself, and at the same time draws it towards the divine realm. That's Metropolitan Callistos' quote. And also, Losky has talked about it by saying the world created in order that it might be deified is dynamic, tending always towards its final end, predestined in the thought wills. The thought wills are just his translation of the logoi. Now, the important thing here is I've explored this in terms not only of the final end, the new creation, the kingdom to come, but also intermediate ends, and especially the evolutionary emergence of humankind.
That's the wrong.
I'm pressing the wrong one here. With a scientific background, I'm hopeless technologically, it should be said. Okay, so first of all, is there a pre-programmed destination in this world? Can we speak theologically about a universe that makes itself, I put that in inverted commas, having, so to speak, a pre-programmed telos, the emergence of beings who can know God? I've referred to this notion as positing an enhanced naturalism there spelt wrongly, I see, and it seems to me that there are certain things in science that actually point in this direction. Before that, though, just mention that, again, this was not unknown in the ancient world, the patristic era. Like St. Gregory of Nyssa and others, Augustine of Hippo saw creation as a single act, the days of creation being interpreted philosophically rather than temporally. And he discussed how God might be seen as creating potentialities that would be actualized at a later stage, seeds. So an acorn, for example, is not an acorn tree, but it has the potential to be an oak tree. In a sense, it has a telos. There is a proper final end to it within the created order. So that was around. And it's interesting that leading patristic scholars like Andrew Louth and Panayotis Nellas have both said that when we look at the patristic understanding, in fact, some sort of evolutionary understanding isn't closed off to us. Again, because of time, I won't sort of read those out. But it's important to recognise that leading Orthodox scholars have recognised that. So what I've proposed is what I've called a revived and revised teleology. Not teleology as understood in medieval philosophy, but actually a convergence between scientific and orthodox theological perspectives. And there's no conflict with scientific perspectives in this view. Rather, it involves a theological interpretation of scientific understandings. Two scientific insights of great importance. One is what's called, again, it's one of these terrible jargon terms, the anthropic cosmological principle. What it means is astrophysicists from at least the 1970s onwards, I was aware of this as a research student in the mid-70s, have increasingly recognised that the universe we live in seems to be very finely tuned for the naturalistic emergence of beings like ourselves. If the strength of gravity, for example, had been only slightly different, slightly less or slightly greater than it is, we wouldn't be sitting here, for all sorts of reasons which astrophysicists in particular can discuss in great detail. Now, there are complications in applying that to theology, but that seems to be an important scientific insight. At least the universe we live in, let's forget other universes which may or may not exist, does seem to, in a sense, have a telos, or at least an intermediate telos. It's the emergence of beings like ourselves. And secondly, evolutionary convergence. Here Simon Conway Morris has made some very interesting comments, because he said, well, his background was one of actually saying, why is it that in the evolutionary process things that actually start off very differently, let's say mammals that move into the sea and fish that have always been there, actually end up looking remarkably similar? And the answer, he says, is in fact there is, in a sense, a way in which, purely scientifically, one can talk about the way in which, for instance, having a streamlined body of a sort, a certain type of tail, etc., actually allows evolution and survival in a maritime context. So he says an exploration of how evolution navigates to particular functional solutions may provide the basis for a more general theory of biology. In essence, this approach posits the existence of something analogous to attractors, he's taking that term from chaos theory, by which evolutionary trajectories are channeled towards stable nodes of functionality. It is my suspicion, he says, that such a research programme might reveal a deeper fabric in biology in which Darwinian evolution remains central as the agency, but the nodes of occupation are effectively predetermined from the Big Bang. Again, a sense that the universe is moving towards a predictable outcome, just as in the anthropic principle, there's a sense that it's a universe that seems particularly suited to the evolution of beings like ourselves. So in evolutionary biology, he in fact would argue that if life starts anywhere in the universe, something very like us is actually going to be one of its end products. There are problems with that possibly, but nevertheless. So, is there a distinctively orthodox approach to divine action that can come out of those particular types of insight? I have argued that we can use a three-pronged approach involving an enhanced naturalism, a teleological interpretation of scientific insights, and the cosmic vision of the Byzantine theological tradition, particularly Maximus, to develop a view of divine action in which the distinction between general and special modes of action becomes redundant, and so we can get over the causal joint problem. Can miraculous events be incorporated into this? Well, I think from a theological point of view, especially an orthodox point of view, there are three factors. Our understanding of the term supernatural, Augustine's hints about higher laws of nature, and the notion that this world is actually not natural at all, it's in some sense subnatural. And I'll briefly go through what I mean by those. First of all, the idea of being above nature. The term hypophysis doesn't seem to exist anywhere I've come across it in the literature, but related terms are. And it's a term that's usually translated as supernatural, but because orthodoxy has no pure nature to which grace is added as a supernatural gift, events that are above nature are not supernatural, certainly in the technical Western sense, rather that we might even translate it as paranormal. Secondly, God's providential action in higher laws of nature. As I mentioned earlier, Augustine seemed to think that when a miracle occurs, it's not something supernatural, but that a higher law of nature, one that we can't usually get at or doesn't seem to be usually operative, actually becomes operative. And thirdly, and this is most important, I think, because orthodoxy has a strong sense of the importance of the world to come. The picture on the slide shows, in fact, something from, not from the Eastern Orthodox world, but it was clearly done by Byzantine craftsmen. It shows, first of all, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and then being thrown out and given the garments of skin by God, which are talked about in Genesis 3, chapter 21. And the Orthodox view has always said that there are two transformations in the cosmos. The first is to go from Eden, which is regarded in some sense as natural because it represents God's real intentions for us, to this world, which in some sense is subnatural. And I'm taking this very largely from the work of Panagiotis Nellas. Then there's a second transformation from this world to the new creation, what theologically we might call the eschatological state. And that's in some ways a return to Eden, but it's also more than that. So it's not just a return to the natural world, it's an enhanced natural world. And the garments of skin, which are seen in that second part of the picture, are what God has given us that's appropriate to this world. As I say, Penteosus Nellis is probably, of all Orthodox writers, the person to look at in relation to this. Now, can we believe in the fall? This is actually a difficult one scientifically, because the effects of the fall, things like death, were evident long before humans evolved. Now, it seems to me there are 4 possible solutions to this problem which different people have talked about. One is to follow those fathers who saw the fall not as a historical event at all, but as in some sense meta-historical, as a fall into our present space-time universe. That's there particularly in those who are influenced by origin. Secondly, we can see our present universe as in some sense anticipating our fall. And it's interesting that Maximus's view of creation and the fall as effectively simultaneous seems to sort of be a way of talking about that in Orthodox terms. Thirdly, we can see the fall narrative as using God's original intentions to point towards his ultimate intentions. So we don't, in that sense, say there was an Eden, but it points us towards what God intends for us ultimately. The last one is an interesting one, which is actually to say that the fall did occur in the early evolution of humanity. He sees death not as meaning biological death, but spiritual death. And that's a view that's been explored by Dennis Alexander of the Faraday Institute here at Cambridge. Now, I'm not going to point towards any one of those 4 as the way forward, so to speak. It seems to me that we've got to work through that. But the important thing is that there is a sense in a lot of Orthodox writing that miracles are not supernatural in the Western sense, but they're an anticipation of our restoration to our natural state. The wolf shall lay down with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, we find in the book of Isaiah. What do we see in the lives of the saints? We see something very similar to that. St. Francis and the wolf of Gubbio, St. Seraphim and the bear. The third one, not really an icon of any sort, but nevertheless it's supposed to represent St. Cuthbert and the sea creatures on Lindisfarne. So there is a sense in Orthodox thinking that sacraments and miracles are a return to the natural. There are interesting implications which I've written about for the problem of natural evil there. Okay, we must get quickly through. There are various differences. I've talked about them, so I won't sum them up. I shall point towards this book, which I won't necessarily recommend, partly because it wasn't written for an Orthodox audience, partly because it's quite speculative in places. But there is a further study which is more consciously aimed at an Orthodox audience, which will be published, I hope, later this year by the St. Vladimir's Seminary Press. It's called Christianity and Science, an Eastern Orthodox View of the Science-Theology Dialogue. But I would just point to one thing before we finish. Sarah Lane Ritchie, who is a postdoctoral student, well not student anymore, postdoctoral researcher at the University of St Andrews, has written a very interesting paper only last year, which is being turned into a book for the Cambridge University of Press later this year. And she points out that what I've said about orthodoxy is beginning to be said also in the Western theological world. She sees new approaches to Thomism in the work of Michael Dodds. She sees basically understandings that come out of the charismatic and Pentecostalist tradition in the work of Amos Young and James Smith, as all pointing in the same direction. In a sense, we're saying, look, the metaphysical commitments of the science theology dialogue of the last 50 years are wrong. Do we have an autonomous universe, as usually assumed? No. In the theological turn, there's no pure nature. What is truly natural is not the empirical world of everyday experience, but what I call enhanced naturalism, and Smith, interestingly, independently, calls enchanted naturalism. The 3 approaches have in common, first of all, the idea that the world is at its most natural in relation to God, that miracles may be seen as what Smith calls sped-up versions of the normal, and there's a strong eschatological focus, at least in my work and in Smith's. And I do wonder whether we might combine an Orthodox Logos understanding and a Pentecostalist Spirit understanding to develop a truly Trinitarian understanding of divine action. The Son and the Spirit, after all, in Orthodox thinking, are the 2 hands of the Father, as Irenaeus put it. And as the Cappadocian fathers stress so often, there is a sense in which all divine action is Trinitarian action. That's for the future, but I think Sarah Lane Ritchie is, within the Western theological world, a figure to watch. I'm going to finally end now just by quoting something from Metropolitan Anthony of Suras. Metropolitan Anthony was clearly worried that some people react against new insights because they feel they've got to hold on to what they were brought up with or what they perhaps mistakenly regard as tradition. And he said this: when a scientific model is first developed, the good scientist's reaction will be to go round and round this model in all directions, examining and trying to find where the flaw is, what the problems are which are generated by the model he has built, the theory he has proposed, by the hypothesis he has now offered for the consideration of others. At the root of the scientist's activity, he says, is the certainty that what he is doubting is the model he has invented, that is, by the way he has projected his intellectual structures on the world around him and on the facts, the way in which his intelligence has grouped things. But what he is also absolutely certain of is that the reality that is beyond his model is in no danger if his model collapses. The reality is stable, it is there. The model is an inadequate expression of it, but the reality doesn't alter because the model shakes. And he goes on to say, the scientist's doubt is hopeful, it is joyful. It is destructive of what he has done himself because he believes in the reality that is beyond and not in the model he has constructed. This we must learn as believers for our spiritual life, both for the highest forms of theology and in the small, simple, concrete experiences of being a Christian. On the last slide, he goes on with this. Whenever we are confronted with a crossroads, whenever we are in doubt, whenever our mind sees two alternatives, instead of saying, "Oh God, make me blind, oh God, help me not to see, oh God, give me loyalty to what I now know to be untrue," we should say, God is casting a ray of light, which is a ray of reality on something I have outgrown, the smallness of my original vision. I have come to the point where I can see more and deeper. Thanks be to God. And my own view is that the modern sciences can indeed help us to see more and deeper. Thanks be to God. I'm sorry I've gone slightly over the hour and I was asked to do it within 50 minutes. I hope you'll forgive me for that.
Would you like
I don't know that I can say very much in response to all that, which is probably just as well. But I'd like to pick up on the last point, the positive approach that one sees in Metropolitan Anthony, who of course is an interesting example of somebody with a scientific medical background, looking at the world theologically. But it has to be said that this approach of fear, probably not in this room, but more widely in Orthodoxy, is still a real problem. And, thinking about this, I was thinking of a line from the Greek poet George Zeferis. How did we fall into the pit of fear? It was not written in your destiny or in mine. And that, I think, is very true of Orthodoxy, particularly confronted with questions of science. We all know about the what's been called the Western captivity of Orthodox theology, a time when, rather than thinking theologically in their own terms, Orthodox were using essentially Roman Catholic arguments against Protestants and Protestant arguments against Roman Catholics. And this sort of Western captivity continued far longer in thinking about religion and science. I mean, an interesting example, the very eminent Russian geneticist working in America, Theodosius Dobzhansky, has a book, The Biology of Ultimate Concern, where he's trying to think philosophically and religiously about, what do biology, genetics, evolution mean. I can't remember whether there may be one footnote that mentions Florensky, or perhaps not, but basically the only church father he refers to is Augustine. And I think it's, and I'm certainly not taking a sort of doctrinaire anti-Western approach. I think it's very important, and Father Christopher has illustrated this, how much we can learn and use the thinking that has been done by Western scientists, theologians, but also, but on the other hand, there is also in popular thinking this problem of taking things like biblical literalism or attitudes which are essentially based in deism, and not appreciating that these actually come out of a very different theological background, and essentially, in many cases, while there's so much we can take from the Western approaches, we will see, as Father Christopher has illustrated, that some of the presuppositions and indeed some of the problems really disappear when we start more carefully to look at the Eastern patristic tradition and the presuppositions that come out of that tradition. I will be quiet at this point and leave the discussion to other people.